Okay, thank you so much for joining, Beth. You maybe want to start just talking a bit about you and what you're doing and how you got into this line of work.
Yes, of course. So I've been working as a specialist eating disorder dietitian since 2020. So at the moment I work full time for my own private clinic. So I see clients on like a one-to-one basis, either online or in person in London. So my route into becoming a dietitian was a little bit complicated or long, I should say. So I kind of finished my undergraduate degree, which was in biomedical sciences, and I then did an eating disorders and clinical nutrition masters. Whilst I was on that masters, realised, and we'll probably talk about this a bit later, that I really needed to qualify as a dietitian in order to work within eating disorders. So after I finished that masters, I worked in a few different settings as a healthcare assistant and a dietetic assistant. And then I went back to university and did another master's in dietetics, which took me to kind of up to 2020. And then since then, I've worked as a specialist eating disorder dietitian.
What made you decide that this was an area that you wanted to work in?
Yeah, I think that it's for me, it's a crossover between nutrition and like psychological well-being and the role that food plays in that. So I'm far more interested in, why we make certain food choices, what influences them, than like nutritional science itself, which is obviously important. But I'm much more interested in kind of like how our mind works alongside food in terms of food choices. It was a bit unusual that I knew that I wanted to specialize in eating disorders before I qualified as a dietitian. So normally people tend to specialize kind of afterwards once they've worked in a few different areas, whereas I went straight into eating disorders once I qualified.
Yeah, yeah, exciting. Yeah, it is a fun area to work in. I mean,
Yes.
it's challenging, right? Because there often is a lot of resistance, a lot of mixed
Yeah,
feelings, and a lot of anxiety coming up.
definitely. And I think, to be fair, I think that that's probably part of what enticed me towards it, is that it is a very challenging space to work in, particularly as a dietitian. So, we're often representing, you know, a client's biggest fear and talking about really difficult things. And, obviously that can come out in a whole host of different ways when you're working with somebody. But for me, working with somebody to try and not just explain what they need to be doing, but actually helping them to put that into practice is the part of the job that I enjoy most. So working with that ambivalence and, trying to come up with a solution that feels manageable for somebody and really having to think out of the box sometimes. Like, I think that that's probably what entices me most to the speciality.
Absolutely. And I'm also curious to hear a bit about what you think around when should someone work with an eating disorder dietitian? Because I sometimes work with clients where they're like, well, I know everything about food. Why do I need a dietitian? And I'm kind of like, hey, I think it could still be a good idea because a dietitian can help, actually taking that knowledge into action, right? A bit curious what your thoughts are. Is it an essential or like when do you know, okay, that was my sign to contact a dietitian?
Yes. I mean, I think if you are experiencing any kind of like distress or confusion around food and recognize that your eating behaviors are problematic, I think that there's space and a role for a dietitian, definitely. I do hear that a lot in terms of like, what we do in a space if like I know what I should be eating and what that should look like. And I have entire sessions with clients where we don't talk about food at all, because an eating disorder dietitian will be very well equipped to work on why something is so difficult, like what are the barriers, what's getting in the way, whether that's emotional, practical, fears around weight recovery, all of those kinds of things. And actually having a space for that is really important. And I think sometimes for lots of people, especially the initial part of working with a dietitian, there can be a sense of relief, of letting go of the responsibility of having to make all of those food choices every single day without any external guidance. And even if you know what that should look like, that is a huge emotional toll for somebody at like early stages of recovery, and being able to kind of put that with somebody else to take responsibility and hold that for a period of time, I think can be really helpful at the beginning.
Yeah. think that's such a good point. What I often see is that people, they know so much about food, they know so much about recovery, they know what to do, and then they're like, why am I not doing anything if I know it, right? And that's what
Mhm.
sometimes we're working with the professional come into the picture. Someone can help guide you a bit, someone where you can actually set more like a specific to do, right?
Yes, yeah, because actually it's really, you know, there can be so many different things that somebody needs to implement, or lots of different goals to get to where they want to or where they need to be. But sometimes you just need a space to break all of that down, because knowing where to start when there might be 10 goals in front of you, 10 different things at least that maybe you need to change in the way you're engaging with food, and knowing that and actually taking that first step are two very, very different things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Even though a lot of people with eating disorders may have a lot of nutritional knowledge, what I
Mm.
do see is that sometimes they may not have as much accurate knowledge for
Yes.
themselves. Like they may think that they know everything about nutrition, yet when you look at their diet, you see that, oh, you're actually eating very little fat. Like you're very attached to certain like diet culture rules. So
Mhm.
even though they may feel like they know a lot, they may also have absorbed a lot of myths and be acting a lot out of fear and maybe not be eating actually enough or enough fats, enough carbs, right?
Yes, very, very, very common. And because, somebody with an eating disorder or disordered eating is likely to take what they hear in
Mm.
terms of like how we should be eating to an extreme, and also to take on every single thing that they hear, they can end up with a very like depleted diet very quickly, even if it feels like it's coming from a place of I'm listening to information that I've been told. And I often work with clients that they'll say, I get that other people need to do that, but I don't believe that I do. And obviously then it's thinking about like, okay, what maybe makes you feel like your body works differently, or you've got different needs to other people. And often that comes from a much more emotional place than than nutritional anyway. Um, so yeah, I think nutrition knowledge versus diet myths and things is obviously a very different thing, and something that I see in clinic all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an eating disorder, per definition, is that your thoughts and feelings and actions about food are so off the charts that it is a mental health condition, right? So
Yes.
then the expectation being, oh, well, if you just know a lot about food, you should know how to feed yourself. It's not really realistic either.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And I think that's actually a recent conversation that I've had with a few clients, is
Mm.
and maybe that's kind of come off the back of kind of weight loss drugs and things, that what makes my experience different to everybody in
Yeah.
society has food rules or is worried about their weight or their body image. And I'm often kind of reflecting the extremities of your behaviors around food, and the level of distress and anxiety you're feeling is like very, very high for, what we might consider to be body image concerns that we might see across kind of society as a
Yeah.
whole, that, most people would be able to make choices and still engage with life and experience joy around food, despite maybe having those body image thoughts or some negative perceptions towards certain foods. Like it's not stopping them from functioning in their like day-to-day life. So that's an important thing, I think, for people to recognize, and what makes an eating disorder essentially.
Exactly. Because this is what I often hear from people in recovery, that they're very resistant because they're like, oh yeah, but everyone like hates their body a little bit. Everyone is like dieting a little bit here and there. Why am I not allowed to do it? And it's
Yes.
like, I mean, first of all, I think also sometimes people with eating disorder may overestimate how involved everyone else is in diet culture, right?
Mhm.
And also overestimate how seriously people take it when they make a comment like, "Oh, I should cut carbs," and then they don't do it,
100%.
right? So it's
Yeah.
like the eating disorder just loves to use that tool of rationalization, of being like, well, it's fine, everyone
Mhm.
feels this way, and it's like, are you sure about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, like the society that we're in at the moment, I think that diet culture and things like it almost gets spoken about like the weather. It's just like a
Yeah.
conversation point in terms of, oh, I'm not eating this at the moment. And actually, I often say that I'm like, how seriously is someone taking that rule? Is that something that they've just a flyaway comment that they've made about something, rather than they're living their whole life dictated by these rules that they've implemented around food. And yeah, I totally agree. I think that it makes it difficult in recovery to recover within an environment like that. I think it can make it a lot harder than it needs to be. But I think that getting caught up in the comparison of why can other people do this and I can't is a really it's a very manipulative way of the eating disorder to push the focus elsewhere, basically.
100%. It's almost a reason to recover. Sometimes people think, oh, well, but there's so much diet culture chatter everywhere, so then I need to have my eating disorder because I won't
Mhm.
handle that world without it. But I always tell people that when you reach full recovery, you will be way more resilient to those comments. I
Yes.
remember for myself during my eating disorder, it will be like the tiniest little comment or indication that someone was like not eating a certain food or going on a diet. It would just make me so angry. And now it's just like, if people start that conversation now, of course, outside of my work, it's very different when it is more related to client work. But when people without eating disorders start that conversation, it's more like I respond in the same way that if they were talking about doing the dishes, like something really boring. It's more just like, it's like a little bit sad, kind of boring, you know? And I think that's one of those things that I didn't realize until I was recovered. Like, whoa, like it's so relieving not being so hyper vigilant all the time, not being so easily triggered.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, you know, people do worry, I guess, how am I going to continue to be able to cope with comments,
Yeah.
etc. I might be changing, but the society around me might not be
Yeah.
changing. But you're so like that resilience does increase loads. And I've worked with clients who were really, really impacted by diet culture and what they were reading or listening to, and have now got to points where they genuinely can laugh because they can see how ridiculous, and inaccurate the information is, that it doesn't bother them more than, as you said, feeling a little bit annoying and boring. Um, and actually being able to find some kind of humor in it because they've learned so much and they're in such a more robust place with their own choices that they're not as fragile or as impacted by them.
Mm. I think that's the important point that they're in a more like robust place with their own choices. Because when you start recovery, you're not in a confident place with your own food choices. And then with time, when you just feel more kind of like you start trusting yourself more, you trust that you're doing the right thing, then it kind of loses power over you when you hear those comments.
Yeah, and trust is such a key word when it comes to rebuilding your relationship with food in recovery. And I guess going back to that point around when does someone need a dietitian, I think that having that external person when your trust within yourself and your own choices is like really wavering can be really a helpful tool in rebuilding that trust, because you could start to rebuild that trust with somebody that you're forming a therapeutic connection with, and then you can start to rebuild that with kind of your own choices and your own decisions. But that is definitely very fragile at the beginning, and that's why those comments from other people feel like such a knock, because your confidence is already in like a fairly low place in terms of making those recovery choices.
Mm. Yeah. I think that that's a good point. It's almost like in the beginning, if someone has zero trust in themselves and their own food choices, sometimes almost being like, well, at least I can trust my dietitian for a
Yes.
bit, right?
Yeah.
And then you build gradually the trust in yourself. And I think that's an important point, that you're supposed to eventually build the trust in yourself, but sometimes some people may be in such a vulnerable state in the beginning that they need to almost borrow the
Yes.
trust from
Yeah, yeah.
from their team, and that's okay.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's where that sense of relief can come, because when you've been, I work with lots of people who have been fighting things, those kinds of thoughts for a really long time with like very little support.
Yeah.
And that takes a huge emotional toll. It's exhausting having to try and, challenge and fight against those all the time. I think part of the work that I talk about a lot is about reducing decision making, because decision making when it comes to food in recovery is a lot. And, for the average person, deciding what they want for breakfast is one choice, it's one decision. But for somebody with an eating disorder, when you break that down, what to have, how much of it to have, how should I portion it, what yogurt should I buy, what bread should I buy, how many eggs do I have, like all of that decision is exhausting to have to do that multiple multiple times a day. So part of working with a dietitian is reducing those number of decisions because they've been made already in sessions, in discussion, and they've been kind of set. So that's, I think, another kind of, I guess, valuable part of working with somebody.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Because so many times what can be exhausting in recovery is that it is a constant, like that mental tug of war. Should I not? How
Yeah.
much? What? When? I love what you said, like taking away decisions. And I'm curious to hear, what does that practically look like?
Mhm.
Do you typically do with clients? I understand this may vary a bit, but is it typically through like a meal plan or a structure, certain
Mhm.
agreements that you set, goals?
Yes. So I think that it depends on the individual. So I think when people hear meal plan in recovery, the assumption is that it's maybe very rigid, or maybe there's even calories in there, because some treatment settings, that is the experience that people have had when it comes to meal plans. So I tend to work from a meal plan, but what it looks like varies massively. So I feel like it's almost, there's a spectrum. So one end of the spectrum might be somebody that needs some really kind of specific guidance, and that might be, okay, we've got one type of breakfast we're having at the moment, and this is your portion guidance. But I will only ever use household measurements for portion guidance, so never weights or anything like that, because yeah, I just don't think it's helpful or necessary at all. Um, and then there might be like specific snacks, and there might even be brands. So for some people, the idea of going and buying a granola bar is so overwhelming, and the pull towards the safer, maybe less adequate options is really strong. So we'll be like, okay, let's pick 3 different types that you can go for when you go to the supermarket. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, I might have people that are on more kind of structures with kind of boundaries within that. So 3 meals and 3 snacks, eating every 3 hours, including all of the food groups at each meal. Here's a snack list of different snacks that you can choose, that kind of thing. And actually, I think most people, even when we're thinking about intuitive eating and people that aren't on a meal plan and aren't in recovery, will have some kind of structure to the way that they're eating. Like, people don't actually wake up every morning and think, oh, like, what do I fancy? Or, maybe I'll have my lunch at like 11 or 3 today. Like, we all have structure to our days depending on our job or our work or our plans or what we're doing. Food that's in the fridge, if I bought bagels for lunch, I might get to Thursday and not want a bagel. I'm probably still going to have a bagel because that's what I bought and that's what's in the fridge. So I think it's reminding people it, that it is normal to have some kind of structure and external guidance around what we're eating, even recovery and beyond. Because I get lots of clients that are so panicked by the idea of intuitive eating, because they're like, I don't understand how I get from where I am now to that. And when we actually break it down, they're like, oh, it's actually not as kind of do what you want whenever you want as maybe people think that it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I think a lot of people think intuitive eating means thinking more about food, but actually a lot of times it's about thinking less, right? It is about, yeah, most people, like you said, will have like a rough kind of structure and
Mhm.
schedule rather than sitting there hyper focusing. Am I hungry now? How hungry am I? Am I allowed to eat now? I
Yeah,
think the only thing I think people get really hung up on sometimes is that, oh, but what if I'm hungry between meals? What if I eat the bagels and then I want the cake? And it's like, yeah, you can still do that,
yeah.
but making sure that you at least get in regular, consistent meals is so, so, so important for recovery.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's that's probably the thing that changes, is the thing that changes the most, kind of transitioning from a more specific meal plan to intuitive eating. I always say to clients, it's usually snacks, it's the in-between stuff. Meals probably aren't going to change that much in terms of, having 3 meals and eating regularly. Like, that's probably going to look quite similar whether you're, consider yourself to be in recovery or, further along in the process. And it's part of it is being able to lean into hunger. So that's always I often get clients that kind of are very uncomfortable, understandably, with the idea of eating when they're not hungry or eating when they're maybe full, which is, really necessary at certain points of recovery. And I often will ask them, like, would you feel able to eat beyond what was on your plan or what you normally have, because your hunger was higher. And if the answer is no, then I'm very much like, we're not in a space that we're ready to just respond to fullness and stop eating when we're full, or to not eat when we're hungry. And you actually need that regularity and that structure to take over that decision making for you at the moment, because you've got to be able to lean into hunger if you're going to start leaning into fullness.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's intuitive eating is not the hunger-fullness diet where it's like you're only allowed to eat when
Mhm.
you're hungry. And then also sometimes we all have times where maybe we eat a meal and we're feeling full and we're just like, oh yeah, but there was some tasty dessert. I'm gonna have that. It is a normal part of eating. I think like when it comes to meal plans, I understand it's not for everyone. I understand some people, they kind of just reach a point where they're just like, I just know what I need to do and I'll do it. But
Mhm.
the thing is that that's not the case for everyone. And what I see sometimes in recovery spaces that concerns me a little bit is that there's a group of people where, realistically speaking, they're not just kind of going to go for it. They're not just going to be like, I'm just going to eat. I'm super hungry. I'm just going to give myself all the food. They are not going to do that. They're going to sit there and overthink and end up undereating and overanalyzing and then not recover. And I think it's so important to tell those people that it is okay if you temporarily need a bit more structure, a bit more guidance. I was one of those people. I needed a certain structure. I needed that because I needed to eat a lot more than what I was hungry for to restore weight, to get to a good place. And it is okay. There are many ways to get to full recovery. There's not like one way. And if you don't do it that way, there's no point in trying. And I think that sometimes frustrates me a bit what I see sometimes in recovery
Yes.
spaces.
Yeah. I think there can be a little bit of, especially in the online space, a little bit of kind of glamorization around recovering in like a certain way, because, the all-in approach, for example, to recovery, if we're talking about making like content or reels on Instagram, probably going to be more, it's going to be more inclined to be able to make content from somebody going all into recovery than somebody following a meal plan every day. So that's the space that I feel like it shows up in a lot. And actually, in the same way that I wouldn't work with any client in a specific way, it would always be individualized. I don't have a blanket way of working with clients. And I think that can put people off recovery because their fear is, I won't be able to kind of go all in like that and just let go of all of my behaviors and rules. So maybe I'm never going to recover. And and the other thing with that is I think that you've got to have such a strong support system to be able to recover in that way, because the feelings that come up with, okay, I'm just going to do everything, can be absolutely huge. And some people aren't in a position to have that support system. Some people don't have lots of people around them to maybe sit with them after a meal, or maybe they've got their dietitian session once a week. But I think you need to have quite a strong level of regular input and support to be able to cope with the emotions and feelings that come up with, I'm just going to challenge everything all at once.
Exactly, exactly. I think it's just people are different in recovery. Different people need different approaches. There's
Mhm.
no one size fits all. As long as you are not using that as a reason to not challenge, be like, well, no, recovery looks different for everyone, so I'm going to restrict my way through it, right? Of course, there is balance here, but yeah, I think things like all in can also be really. It can be good, especially for people if they're going through a period of they have really high hunger, right? They feel psychologically like they are going to handle
Yes.
leaning into it. But one problem that I sometimes see, because I sometimes support people going through when they decide to do recovery that way. But what I sometimes see the problem is that when that eventually ends, and sometimes the appetite then goes down, and they never have had much like meal regularity, they kind of just been eating all the time, which
Yes.
sometimes can happen in recovery. But then they're like, well, I'm not hungry anymore, so when do I eat? And then they end up unintentionally restricting and relapsing, right? So I think that's another thing that's something to be a bit aware of.
Yes, definitely. It's building that foundation of being used to eating regular meals, regular adequate meals, and kind of missing that step can feel quite difficult, because the extreme hunger does end. Obviously it's important everyone hears that because it's obviously incredibly reassuring, but it does end. It gets to a point where your body feels safe and it feels comfortable, and you've got to know how to manage that and what your body needs and how to eat in a contained way once that happens. And yeah, I've definitely seen that before when people have not found that part of recovery yet and really, really struggle with it, even if they've maybe got to a place where they've weight recovered, knowing, okay, what do I do now? This is like a new phase, basically.
Exactly. Because when you're used to being really hungry and then eating, which of course, as you should. But then what happens then if you're not that hungry anymore and you may be like, oh well, I'm used to eating is something that happens only when I'm really, really hungry. And if I'm not really, really hungry, then do I eat? And that's why I think having like a rough structure where it's like, no, when you wake up in the morning, you have breakfast. Hungry or not, doesn't matter. You have breakfast, right? Can be so, so helpful.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think, most people really are not sitting and, you know, working out where their hunger and fullness is on a scale of 1 to 10 before every time they eat. You eat breakfast because you've got breakfast, and it's lunch because you've got a gap in meetings during the day, so you're going to have lunch. It doesn't really, you're not necessarily thinking like, oh, my hunger's not quite where it normally is, so maybe I should wait. And I actually think those kinds of thoughts are more disordered than intuitive.
Exactly, exactly. And I think a common concern that I hear from people when it comes to like having more like regular meals is, well, what if I'm not hungry for the meal? But then also the thing of like, what if I'm hungry for more? What if I have a meal plan of, let's say, 3,000 calories and I am hungry for 4,000 calories? Like, am I not allowed? Like, is it like a maximum? Like, what do you say to clients who come
Yeah.
with that experience?
So I'm always very, very clear that the meal plans that I have with clients are like a basic minimum. It's a safety net so that, okay, I need to not have less than this. This is my like basic requirements that I need to be aiming for every single day. And rather than, and it's really tricky because it's very easy for people to fall into a place of this is a maximum because this is what I've been given permission for. But I will often also put kind of annotations on meal plans. So if there are particular times of the day where maybe hunger's slightly higher, what I might put in is, okay, this is the plan for afternoon snack. And then underneath, I might kind of put optional such and such, depending on hunger levels, or just creating some kind of like permission around eating around the meal plan. So putting some notes on it and stuff can be a bit helpful, but I'm always very, very clear that I think calling it a safety net, I find quite helpful. It's to stop you, it's to catch the eating disorder before it kind of escalates, to stop you from going any further or any lower, to keep things stable, basically.
Such an important reframe. Like, this is the minimum, this
Mhm.
is the safety net. And if you suddenly think, well, would quite like a chocolate bar, or I'm feeling quite hungry, I want a second portion, like that's fine, right?
Absolutely.
But it's just that having a bare minimum is just so important because sometimes if there isn't any, the eating disorder use can sometimes use that to
Yes.
restrict, right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think it's really important, I think, that dietitians do frame meal plans in that way, because I'll often say like, yes, I'm a dietitian and I'm a healthcare professional and I'm qualified and I've been working in this field for a long time, but I do not know your body better than you do. I don't. Like, this meal plan, the meal plan is workable. So we start it from a place where I'm like, okay, this feels like it's probably going to be a good first step from where we are at the moment and what your goals are. But it has to evolve over time. So there will be a point where actually that meal plan doesn't feel like it works anymore. We've got to go back to the drawing board, what's working, what's not working. So it's always a very, very flexible thing. I'm constantly adapting and changing people's meal plans based on what they're telling me. That includes how their body is responding to it and how their body feels, because I don't know them and what their needs are better than their body does. Their body knows far more than I do.
Absolutely. And I think that is also one of the reasons why it's so important to see an eating disorder dietitian, right?
Yes.
To see someone who knows specifically what works and doesn't for people with eating disorders. Because
Mhm.
I've seen a few times people have seen maybe like a general dietitian, or they've seen like some kind of like nutrition advisor that's
Yeah.
like, yeah, like not really completely qualified, and they've been given really, really counterproductive advice, and that made them lose faith in dietitians as a whole. So I have this conversation so many times with clients where I
Mhm.
will encourage seeking out a dietitian, eating disorder dietitian,
Mhm.
and they'll be like, yeah, but I have seen a dietitian or a nutritionist or a
Yeah.
nutritional advisor,
Mhm.
and they told me insert triggering thing essentially, and I have to kind of explain, well, that's not everyone. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm sure you probably would agree with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I've definitely seen lots of that, unfortunately. And it usually ends up either being very just very specific guidance that feels trapping for people. You know, if I have to stick to this exact, or the exact meals they've told me to eat. And there isn't like a magic cure for recovery that involves specific foods. That's really important. Food groups, yes, we've got to include all food groups, but the idea that you have to have very specific meals and they're the only meals you can have is not in line with eating disorder recovery, because no specific food is going to heal you from your eating disorder. And there can be a lot of, I've worked with people that have been told some very triggering things around not eating certain food groups, or, you know, cutting out certain things, you know, avoiding ultra processed foods, whatever it might be, that is just so unhelpful for somebody with an eating disorder. So that's a really big thing, is you really want to find somebody that is an eating disorder specialist. And I think particularly in like the private field, I normally do tell people to just be wary of anybody that kind of lists lots of different specialities, you know, because there are things that I absolutely won't. I solely just work with eating disorders because I feel like I can only build my CPD up so much in one area, if I'm honest. You know, there's a lot of information out there, and to stay up to date and to make sure I'm always learning, I can't be doing that in eating disorders and 7 other clinical conditions. So that's something that I normally tell people just be mindful of around, like, you know, are they listing kind of 10 different specialities, for example?
That is such a good, very specific tips when it comes to finding dietitian, but also finding any kind of professional, right? I've seen something similar when people look for a eating disorder therapist, where they will essentially look online for someone where it says specializes in eating disorders. But then if there also is 10 other things, they specialize in every mental health condition under the sun, then chances are they don't really specialize in eating disorders. So looking, finding someone where it's clear like that is like the main area they work, or if they have other specialities, at least not like a bunch of different ones, right?
Yes. Yeah. Because
Yeah.
I think most people that work in eating disorders would probably agree with this, that eating disorders are very unique in that there is, for both, I guess, if you're working as a dietitian and as the therapist, because there's this physical risk crossing over with psychological. And as a dietitian, you need to be able to hold the physical and the psychological. But as a therapist, you also do need to as well, you know, knowing when actually this person really needs a dietitian, or they need a consultant psychiatrist because they probably need things like bloods or whatever it might be. You know, if you're working with eating disorders, you've constantly got to be holding both the physical and the psychological. And that is quite unique and different to other physical health conditions and also other psychological conditions.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's sometimes this unfortunate tendency to see eating disorders as just a mental health condition. Then the assumption is, well, then we just do talking therapy and nothing else,
Yes.
right? And I've seen people where they have spent sometimes years in talking therapy, and the food has never been addressed, right? They never been addressed, the food, in years of talking therapy. And I'm like, to me, like, that's almost quite like neglectful, because an eating disorder, yes, it is a mental health condition, but it is a mental health condition with very significant physical links. Like the mental and physical are not completely separate here.
Yeah, definitely. And there's only, and it's really important that that gets challenged, because for the client, that can feel like a somewhat comfortable space to be in. You know, I can talk about all of this and how difficult things are without having to necessarily face the behavior change, because I'm not really being guided and supported to make those changes. And that can feel really safe and comfortable. And that's probably why people end up in a position where they're engaging in that talking therapy for such a long time without necessarily moving forward in their recovery. And I think it like therapists have to kind of challenge that. And of course it's, you know, up to the individual with what they do with that. You know, whether they take those steps and they reach out to a dietitian or they go to their GP or whatever it might be. But it's definitely our role as clinicians to make, and in the same way that I will always ask people if they're seeing a therapist, or if they are and there's themes that are coming into our sessions, I'll say, like, have you brought that to therapy, for example? So, you know, I think that because eating disorders are so complex, the care has to be holistic. It's very, very unlikely that somebody is going to fully recover from an eating disorder seeing one clinician.
Absolutely, yeah. yeah, see this as well, like that I typically would work on like a team, and it's so important that the team also works together, right? So that because sometimes it can be, yeah, sometimes it can get confusing if someone gets conflicting advice from different team members. So having
Yeah.
like a team that actually communicates so helpful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely. And
Mm.
it's even more important, obviously now working in more of a private capacity and seeing clients in a one-to-one, I always, will reach out to therapists and have calls with, somebody's psychologist, email psychiatrists and things like that, just to make sure that we're linked up and, I guess singing off the same hymn book. Like we've got to all be working together and telling the client, we conflicting, the eating disorder is already so conflicting. You don't want conflicting information also coming from your treatment team.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, adding to the thing of like, when do you know you need a dietitian? Because sometimes people are like, oh, yeah, but I'm already seeing a therapist or a coach or a psychiatrist. But just because you're seeing one professional doesn't mean that it couldn't be a good idea to add in another. I do understand that, accessing dietitians sometimes gets that it's something NHS is especially like the wait list is, yeah, it's
It's
pretty
great.
insane and
Yeah.
it's costly, all of that. But if you have the resource, if you have the
Mhm.
chance, prioritize it, right? And
Yes.
remember that there's a difference between feeling like you're working on something versus working on something. Because I think this is sometimes goes back a bit to what you said
Mhm.
about the talking therapy, and people can get a bit quite comfortable just talking about their eating disorder rather than changing it. But you feel like you're working on this whole eating disorder thing because you're sitting there talking about it every week, but nothing is happening.
Yeah.
So I think this is a good indicator if you find that you're quite stuck in your recovery, especially if you find that the area where you're very stuck in is the food part, like the overwhelm with food, like what should I eat, when should I eat, how should I eat, then
Mhm.
a dietitian, specifically an eating disorder dietitian, can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that yeah, it can feel very comfortable talking about it, and also it creates this sense of, maybe if I talk about it enough or explore the feelings and the emotions enough, that I'll feel ready because it will feel easier. But when it comes to eating disorder behaviors, the thing that makes it feel easier is exposure. And you make the change, nothing catastrophic happens. It undermines the eating disorder belief, and then you do it again and that happens again, and it won't. I can guarantee, I've seen this so many times, it will not get easier sitting in a place of avoidance, because avoidance, the fear, as you're sitting in avoidance, the fear is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you actually take those steps to change it. It won't feel easier unless you start.
100%. Everything is hard before it's easy,
Yeah.
right? And I think this is the like one of the ways to eating disorder trick people and keep people stuck is this idea that, oh yeah, you're not ready now, time is not right, just
Mhm.
wait a bit, just think about it a more, plan it a bit more, and then so much time passes and nothing changes, right? And there's no perfect moment. You're never going to feel completely ready. You have to jump into action, and that is how it actually becomes easier.
Yes, yeah. And it's about being okay with getting it wrong and sometimes failing. And, I see lots of clients who their perfectionism stops them taking a step because they want to wait until they can do it perfectly. And recovery is it's just messy. It is. And sometimes you get it wrong and it's going back to the drawing board. And how did that happen? How can we stop it happening the next time? You've got to be okay with getting it wrong and sometimes failing within recovery. I would much rather see people taking those steps and sometimes it not going to plan and sometimes the eating disorder getting the best of them, than just sitting in a place of, I'm going to wait until I can do it perfectly.
100%, 100%. And I always tell people, like, even if there was such a thing as like a perfect recovery where you
Mhm.
never made mistakes and we could just press a button and that happened, I wouldn't press that button because you learn nothing. So
Yeah.
much of recovery is learning to kind of trust the process, just
Mhm.
jump into it, be a bit wobbly, but still getting through it. And yeah, I see this so many times where people, they feel like if they make one quote unquote mistake in recovery,
Mhm.
then it's just back to square one, right? But actually you
Mhm.
can, learn and grow from those mistakes. Like there's no such thing as a perfect recovery. It's going to be messy, unpredictable, scary, but that is how you learn.
Definitely. And I think that that's so important for people who have gone through relapses or, longer lapses within their recovery is, they'll often very much feel like they've gone right back to the beginning, and I'm always trying to remind people, like, you still learn all of that stuff when you went through recovery, when you got to a better place, and that doesn't all go out of the window just because things have slipped backwards. And actually, often their insight into their eating behaviors and knowing why they do certain things, and why in certain moments something feels really difficult, that doesn't all disappear. You still have all of the information and knowledge. And I think that's so important, because that can be a really difficult place to be in for people, is when they've made progress and then lapsed or relapsed at different points in their recovery. And maintaining that hope, I think part of that is remembering that, you did do all of that work, and that hasn't just disappeared because things have got difficult again.
Exactly. It's the thing of that you're not starting from scratch, you're starting from experience.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I mean, thank you so much for coming on. This has been such a good conversation. And yeah, where can people find you?
People can find me on Instagram at the ED Dietitian. It's dietitian spelled with two T's. Lots of people spell it with a C, but it's got two T's. And on my website, which is www.theeddietitian.com. If people are looking for inquiring into support, you can do that via my website.
I will also add links in the description of the episodes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily.